With 20 international bestsellers, over 70 million books sold, and 10 film adaptations of her work, she has become one of the best-selling authors of our time. From her first triumph, A Woman of Substance, she went on to be offered the highest price ever paid to an author, $30 million for 3 books. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with the First Lady of women's fiction, my friend, Barbara Taylor Bradford. At this point in your career, are there any challenges left for you as an author?
A lot. As a matter of fact, Ernie, every book is a challenge because they don't get any easier. You know, you tackle it all over again. I suppose it's like an actress who, when you say, well, it must be easy now getting in front of a camera or going on a stage, but it isn't for that actress or actor, and it's not for me. But I have one project I want to do.
What's that?
I had the idea for a children's fantasy. And I don't mean like Harry Potter, because everybody is trying to get onto that bandwagon of the Harry Potter books. But more of a real fantasy, you know, into another world, a world that perhaps only exists in my imagination. And I really have to find the time to sit down and write the story, which would be 3 books.
When you say something like that, does that scare your publisher? Do they think, no, don't change a thing, stay right where you are? Or are they very accepting for something like that?
Well, when I mentioned it to my editor in the UK, she said, oh, well, I might lose you because I'm not a children's book editor. And I said, well, you know, this is something that I really will do one day. And when I mentioned it to the editorial director, she said, well, Barbara, I think it sounds great and it will be wonderful, but we'll still need your adult books. So in other words, she was saying, this is not instead of, but as well as the adult books.
When you started off, though, you wrote children's books, correct?
No, I didn't, but I did sell a story when I was 10 to a children's magazine. Actually, I didn't set out to sell it, Ernie. My mother liked it and sent it to the magazine, and after about 3 months, we got a letter and a money order, and that's, I think my destiny was sealed that day.
Do you remember how much that was for?
Something which would be the equivalent of about $10 today. But that was quite a lot of money to a 10-year-old, you know. However, more important was the byline, Barbara Taylor.
Yeah. Do you ever get tired of seeing that? Do you ever think, I've been there, I've done that? Or is it still a thrill each time?
Oh, it's still a thrill. I think if you thought that, you better hang up your pencil or pen or computer, or in my case, typewriter.
You still use a typewriter?
Still use a typewriter.
I had read somewhere in an interview a little while back that you were going to buy a computer and you were going to make the move. I guess you didn't do it?
I have a computer, an Apple, on my desk there, and there's the computer, and then at the side I have my typing table. And you know, I use a computer for research, and it's wonderful to not have to go to a library or go to a bookstore and buy a book about something, but you can find it on the internet. But I can't write on it. I have great trouble.
Really?
The screen, I don't know how to explain it. The screen gets in my way, and I panic if I'm not putting anything on the screen. It's very strange. So I still do it the easiest way for me, on a typewriter. Then I write all over the paper and I retype it.
Really?
And then I look at that and I cross it out and I retype that. And I do that about 3 times. Not every page, but many pages. And what I've actually done by the time the chapter is finished is I've edited the book.
Yeah. Could you give it over to somebody else to retype it, or is that part of your process? You need to go through it again?
That is the organic growth, I think, per page. And it's not every, let's say the chapter's 20 pages. Maybe I do that to about 8. When I'm satisfied, and even if it's still a little bit written on, I send it to a typing agency, to a very nice woman who has other typists, but she actually types mine. And she puts it on a disc. and she sends me the hard copy by fax. I edit it one more time if there's anything to edit, and there usually isn't. And that's it. And by the time I finish the book, she has been getting a chapter at a time from me, so we're almost level. Yeah. And I get the disc and a hard copy at the, more hard copy at the end, and it's finished. And my editors have very little to do.
Yeah. Would it bother you if your editor went in and wanted to make major changes? Is your relationship with your editor at this point where it's pretty much what Barbara Taylor Bradford wants is pretty much what's going out there?
No. I have an editor in England who has been my editor for 25 years. She edited A Woman of Substance, so she's edited every book. I now have an editor here at St. Martin's Press in New York, and she is wonderful. She's very bright, has terrific ideas. She's very sharp on story and plot. And sometimes she's asked me to add things, or she'll say, this is slowing down a bit here, maybe too much description. Can you take out a few paragraphs? And I do, if I agree, because I think you need another pair of eyes. You get very close to a novel. I do anyway, because I'm sort of living it.
Yeah. When you look back and read some of your earlier works, do you edit at that point? Do you look and say, oh, I should have changed that, or are you pretty much at peace with it?
No, because I don't go back and read all the books. I read bits and pieces here and there. And what I think is, did I write this? I can't remember writing this book. And it's funny because you sort of know in your head the storylines and characters of different books. But, I kind of look and my eyes widen and I think, gee, this is really good. Did I write this? When did I write it? I don't remember.
Now, with A Woman of Substance, big, huge, first big time out there. Maybe
yes.
2 sequels off of that book. Then years later, you've revisited those characters.
Yes.
When you went to revisit those characters, did you have to go back and refresh your mind with what had happened in the earlier books, or were they still so close to you that you could carry on?
Well, I pretty much knew if I sat and thought, I could sort of run the book through my head like unraveling a piece of film. But when I actually decided to write Emma's Secret, I really did have to, before I kind of did it, well, I did, I can't say kind of, because I didn't really do it at all. But what I did do was think out a storyline for Emma's Secret to discuss with the editors, because otherwise I would have had to write it out. And I feel sometimes doing an outline for me these days is almost killing the book for me. I like to see it as a journey. I know vaguely the story and then just go into it. I really had to visit the characters I was going to use rather than read the whole book. I mean, I looked at certain things in A Woman of Substance because I really had to find a patch of book where I hadn't developed enough of Emma. And Bob had always said to me, the war years, the Second World War, you tell a lot of it in narrative exposition, which I had, with little snippets of scenes with her sons coming back from fighting in the war and all that. So I visited characters because remember one thing, in those 2 books, Emma's Secret and Unexpected Blessings, I am with the great-grandchildren of Emma, who I didn't know as adults until I started Emma's Secret, because they were children in To Be the Best. So aside from looking at A Woman of Substance to find the patch of Emma's life where I could fill it out again, I actually had to look at those children.
Yeah.
And a funny thing happened. As I read the one chapter where they're all together and sort of at each other's throats and misbehaving, I realised that some were nice and some weren't so nice. And I had to think for a long time, do we change?
Uh-huh.
Will we be the same at 25 as we were at 5? And I really had a dilemma there because I wasn't sure. And I thought a lot about people I knew and I'd known all my life, and I finally plunged and said, we will remain the same, more or less. The child that is good will be the good child. The child that's naughty or wicked will remain the same as an adult. And that's what I did. And I was in London for the publication of Emma's Secrets a couple of years ago. And I just happened to glance at one of the daily papers, I think it was the Times, and there was a long story on one of the feature pages about a study of children and that they had been studied as children and through their lives by a team of psychiatrists and psychologists, and the decent, good children became good and responsible adults. And
so you did it right.
I did it right. And I clipped it out. I was so pleased. But I did have to say to myself, now, is Tessa going to be mean? And is she going to be competitive? And I was right.
The thing that starts that whole question for me is the fact that Woman of Substance you wrote years ago, it still sells well today. So people are just having read it and going into these new books where you've put all of this, you've had so many books between them that to make sure you're where the reader is, because a lot of people are going to say, oh, I'm going to read this, I'll read A Woman of Substance and get back into it. So they know it as though it just happened. So.
And don't think that I haven't got the films that Bob makes mixed up with the books, because I think I know them all so well. And a woman wrote to me recently and said, I don't know how you could say that it was Paula who fired Jonathan, Paula and her father, because it wasn't. It was her cousin Sandy. And I thought, no, the woman's wrong. But then I thought, oh no, in the film, the man who played Paula's father was complaining he didn't have enough lines, so we let him do the firing. But in actuality, in the book, the woman was right. Sandy fired Jonathan.
Uh-oh.
And things like that, but they always write. They love to write and tell you if something's not quite right.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you read your own reviews?
I do. I read good reviews and I read bad reviews, and I really don't care about either, because I've discovered that they really don't matter. And a friend of mine in London who does what you do, he's a journalist, but he also has a TV show of interviews, and he said to me once, does it bother you when you get a bad review? I said, no, not really, because I can tell from the review that they haven't really read the book. And he said, let me tell you something. Do you know who Sibelius was, Barbara? I said, yes, he was a Finnish composer who lived in London. He said, right. And an interviewer once asked him, what do you think of critics? And Sibelius said, not much, and show me a city where they've erected a statue to one. So I've always remembered that.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I always say is no critic has ever given one person one moment of pleasure ever. And that's true. And I have given millions of people a lot of pleasure from the books.
When you write your books, who are you writing them for at this point? Is it for the audience? Is it for yourself? Who?
I suppose in a way I'm writing them for myself, because that's why you write in a way. It's to sort of make order out of the chaos of the world. But I'm writing them, I think I'm writing them for myself really, but I'm also writing them for women rather than men, although I do have a lot of male readers. Mm-hmm. So I've got an eye on the readership, otherwise I'd just be sitting there writing books for myself which nobody was going to read.
Do you work out problems in your own life through your writing? If you've got something you're struggling with, trying to decide what to do in your own life, do you see it come alive on the pages?
Sometimes little small things, but it was Owen Shaw, you know, the American writer who is now sadly dead, who did say, when again in an interview, he said, I don't need a psychiatrist, I've got a typewriter.
Yeah.
And I guess little things do, and things in your own life that might have been problematical get sort of turned into the book, and friends' problems. You know, my girlfriends tell me problems and say, but don't put it in your book. And I say, well, if I do, it won't have your name attached.
Okay, take us all back to when all of this started. You were a disappointment to your parents because you didn't want to go on to school. You wanted to get out into the real world, correct?
Well, it wasn't school, it was university, actually. And they wanted me to go to Leeds University, and I said, well, no, but I can't do that because I want to be a writer, and, you know, that short story, that fatal short story. And my mother said, no, well, this is silly. You have to go to university. And I was an only child. And so I got myself an interview at the newspaper, at first without telling them I was going for this interview, because I knew they wouldn't let me go. But my shorthand and typing teacher at the school, the girls' school I went to, had arranged this because she thought I wrote well, and that was a way to get me into the newspaper, to go and get a job in the typist pool. Well, I did in the end have to tell my mother, because I'm like that. I'm sort of honourable. And I said, I'm going for this interview. And she had a fit and said, but I'm going with you. And I said, no, I can't go for an interview being led by the hand, you know. And I went for the interview and I got a job in the typist pool. So when I came home and said, well, I did get this job, Mummy, she said, I can't imagine they'll give a 15-and-a-half-year-old a job as a reporter with no training. I said, oh, no, I'm not. I'm a typist. So that made it worse. And I agreed to leave if I didn't like the job. Well, the first few days, I made so many mistakes with my letters. I had so much waste paper of this expensive note paper, you know, the letters that were mostly standard letters, so the other girls were able to help me, that I, having tried to burn it in the newspaper office with fears that the building was going to go up in flames, I then hid it in a cupboard, smoothed it out, hid it, and took it home every day for about 10 days. So by the end of the 10 days, I quite liked it, and so I stayed and got myself moved at one point. I did stories, actually, a few stories, and the editor, I came to the attention of the editor because they didn't know who Barbara Taylor was. Was it a correspondent in Harrogate or Ripon or Doncaster or where? And when they tried to trace the Barbara Taylor who had done these stories, they realised that I sat in the typist pool and it became a sort of cause celeb, if you like, in the newspaper, because it was a big daily newspaper, you know, an evening paper. So the editor sent for me and asked me if I wanted to be a journalist. And I said, oh, I don't want to be, sir. I'm going to be. And I can only say it's a case of fools rush in where angels never tread. That was the beginning. He got me moved to the reporter's room part of the time, and part of the time I did his letters. And eventually they moved me in there permanently when I was about 16 and a half.
Yeah.
And I became women's page editor at 18 and a half and went to work in London when I was 20 on Fleet Street on a magazine. And I stayed on the magazine for a year, and then I got a job on the London Evening News. I went back to newspapers, and I loved it.
Do you miss that ever? Do you miss that kind of stuff?
Sometimes I do, if something in the world is happening, and I think I'd like to go and cover that. But it's a tough life, actually, especially being a foreign correspondent. But, you know, I'm always writing about journalists in many of the books. In Remember, I had a TV journalist, a foreign correspondent, and in several, and in Emma's book, the first book of Emma, A Woman of Substance, her brother Frank is a journalist and comes back in Emma's Secret because he's always covering stuff with Churchill, and she was in that book. He was her great hero.
Now, is that the character based after your father? Was that Emma's brother?
No, that was Emma's older brother, Winston.
Okay.
Winston Hart was really Winston Taylor.
Yeah.
And Frank Hart was the younger brother who was the journalist.
But I've read you don't base your characters on real people most of the time, correct?
No, but I used Daddy for Winston, his namesake.
Yeah.
And my father was in the Royal Navy in the First World War and lost a leg. And so does her brother Frank. So I use that, and I use my parents a little bit, their marriage in Act of Will, and occasionally I put a bit of Bob Bradford in here and there.
So tell me the story of how you met your husband, Bob.
How did we meet? Somebody once invented the idea that it was a blind date, but for me a blind date is standing under a clock in Grand Central Station and meeting this man that walks by who's been told to look for a woman in a red jacket, right? But it was in a way a blind date. He, meaning Bob, was at the Beverly Hills Hotel and ran into a very, very old friend. And so he sat and talked to her for a while. And she said, will you stay and have lunch? He said, no, I've got a meeting and then I've got to go home and pack and I'm going to London. And she said, oh, you must look up my best friend. And I was supposed to go to London and I'd like you to take a message and tell her why I didn't go. And I think he thought, why did she never phone this woman? But anyway, he said, yes, what's the message? Tell me what was wrong. Why didn't you go? And she said, well, you can see I'm taped up. I fell off a junk into the South China Sea and broke my ribs. So just tell Barbara this, and here's her name. So he said, but you want me to phone her? She said, well, I actually don't have her phone number. This was a crazy conversation that could only happen in Beverly Hills, right? And he said, well, how am I supposed to get in touch with her? What's her address? She said, well, I don't have that either, but I've got the telephone number of friends of hers who are friends of mine, and she lives next door to them. So she wrote down the number, gave it to him and said, and he's a screenwriter, this man, Jack Davis is a screenwriter, so call him up and say you want to meet Barbara. So he was in London for a few weeks, and I guess one day he got bored and wasn't too busy, so he called up screenwriter Jack Davis and introduced himself and said, you know, this is who introduced me to you long distance, and I'm looking for Barbara Taylor. Oh, she lives next door. So actually what happened was they invited Bob to lunch and they invited me to lunch on a Sunday, and that's how we met.
Love at first sight?
Well, I liked him immediately because I had a deadline, so it wasn't that easy to get me to this lunch, you see, because I really am very dedicated, and I was working on a magazine at the time. And I said to both of them, Jack and Dorothy Davis, it's not possible for me to come because I don't know how I'm going to have my stuff ready for Monday morning. So they rang my doorbell. They actually came and dragged me almost to the lunch. So I said, okay, I'll be there at noon. And they said, you know, this man is awfully nice and da-da-da-da. And I had just finished an involvement, and I wasn't particularly interested in meeting a man at that moment. So I did go up, and they said he's bringing with him another couple who is making a movie with. So the man was Jesse Lasky Jr., who was a screenwriter from Hollywood, and he was working with Bob on a movie, and the man's wife. So 3 people walk in, a tiny man, a beautiful redhead, and then a taller man. And I thought, well, that redhead's got to be with that tall man, that good-looking man. And the tall, good-looking guy was Bob Bradford. And he came in and he sat on the sofa after he'd been introduced, and he said, you know, and he told me this story, which is really very funny about her, and it was even funnier the way he told it, with no telephone number and no address, and how was he supposed to find me? So we got on very well, and off we go to a lunch outside in a restaurant for Indian food, and not my favorite food, and as it turned out, not Bob's. So we had that discussion, and during the lunch, he said, well, towards the end of the lunch, he said to me, what are you doing later? So I said, oh, nothing.
Forgot about that deadline, huh?
And so my hostess was saying, your deadline. And I said, well, don't worry about the deadline, Dorothy. I'll stay up all night or something, writing. So we went to a movie, and she had said, we can't let him escape. Bring him back for supper. So I took him back to their house for supper, and that was it. Yes, it was a coup de foudre, as the French say. Love at first sight.
What do you think you've learned that you can tell people about what makes a marriage work then?
I think you've got to like somebody to be married a long time to them. I think you've got to like each other, as well as be in love and love each other. And all the things that one associates with being in love. I think you've got to I have to like him, and I have to have a lot of respect for him. And I think I think you have to be on the same wavelength. I mean, he and I are very different in many ways, because he's much quieter than I am, and I tend to be rather gregarious and outgoing. But we do like the same things, and we tend to like the same people.
Okay, last question, and then we'll be done. What have you learned about life through your books?
Oh, nobody's ever asked me that before. Well, I think what happens is you've a lot going on in your head. We all do, if we're intelligent. But when I sit down and have to face those characters and I'm telling a story, I have to really put thoughts into the characters because they can't be vacuous. They have to have thoughts going around and feelings and emotions. And I find that a lot of the stuff in my head, stuff that I've not really paid attention to perhaps, becomes real when I put it down on paper. That may sound very convoluted, and I wonder if you know what I mean. It's you suddenly face reality, and you have to face facts when you're writing a novel, and I do think that I learn from my characters, because as I give them an inner life and an inner being and souls, I understand more about life. I mean, I already know it, and yet I don't know I know it until I see it on paper. Does that make sense, Ernie? That sounds very complex, but it happens.
And with that, I'll say what happens is we run out of time.
Oh,
Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with us again. Barbara Taylor Bradford.
Thank you.
To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.